divers, and happy Halloween Horror Month. It's back again, whether you like it or not. Anyway, I'm Tom Feeney, surrogate mummy, Emmy Award-winning producer, and writer for Wang's Chop Movie Magazine. This week, a special fright-filled episode of Pilot Error, where we look at some truly terrifying television pilots that went to an early grave. Believe it or not, the history of horror-themed television programs is, well, not that extensive. In TV's early days, the only remotely horror-related shows were adaptations of existing radio programs like Inner Sanctum.
This is your host, ready to take you through that creaking door for spine-tingling Inner Sanctum mystery dramas.
In fact, the first 3 decades or so of television's existence had little to no real horror content. One exception possibly being Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone, which occasionally delved into some pretty scary subject matter. Now, if you were a horror fan in those days, your only real source of scares were the late-night horror movies on your local UHF station. Now, it wasn't until the 1970s when changing times and tolerances allowed for more intense over-the-air scares to be broadcast to audiences. And that, my friends, leads us back to one of television's greatest writers and the aforementioned creator of The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling. America seemed ready for a blood-soaked invitation to the Night Gallery. As the first real horror television show, Night Gallery pushed the boundaries of what broadcast television could show. Fun fact, the pilot of Night Gallery featured 3 different segments, including one titled Eyes, starring legendary actress Joan Crawford and directed by a 22-year-old newcomer named Steven Spielberg. The initial success of Night Gallery opened the floodgates for more horror series on TV in the 1970s, the most popular probably being Kolchak, the Night Stalker.
May I introduce myself? My name is Kolchak of the Daily Chronicle.
Kolchak reports the bizarre, the supernatural, the unexplainable.
You again is another crazy story.
This nut thinks he is a vampire.
You know what I call that? Irresponsible yellow journalism.
He has killed 4, maybe 5 women.
I I saw that so-called super killer wipe up the streets with your so-called police force.
They don't want any help from amateur bloodhounds like you.
I've been a reporter for 22 years.
I've been a police officer for 30.
Well, then why don't you retire?
Each man in the field is issued one of these and one of these.
Are you suggesting that we pound one of these into Skorzeny's chest?
No, into his heart.
Darren McGavin, the Night Stalker.
However, even with the new era of permissiveness on TV, there were still very few horror series on television. Why? Well, in 1980, a famous author was quoted as saying, "Television has really asked the impossible of its handful of horror programs. To terrify without really terrifying, to horrify without really horrifying, to sell audiences a lot of sizzle and no steak." Now, that quote came from none other than Stephen King, and who would know better, right? Now, essentially what King meant here is that with the broadcast standards at the time, you really couldn't show anything too scary or intense. You could imply, you could suggest, but that was all. Not to mention the television budgets back then were not near big enough to craft any really scary monsters or gruesome special effects. By the end of the 1980s, though, things did begin to change. Syndicated programs, free from the restrictive boundaries of network television, could do and show more of the scary stuff. Shows like Friday the 13th, the series. Yes, that was a real show, and in my opinion, a really good one. We did an episode on that way back when. Check it out. There was also Tales from the Dark Side and Freddy's Nightmares, based on the Nightmare on Elm Street film series. Now, cable TV got in on the act, having even fewer restrictions than broadcast or syndication. HBO led the way with their adaptation of the classic EC horror comics Tales from the Crypt. And since then, horror has become one of the most popular genres on television. As I speak, there are numerous successful horror shows on the air, including The Last of Us, several different versions of The Walking Dead, and Interview with a Vampire among them. But let's step back a bit to those earlier days when television was trying to find its footing when it came to horror, and typically failing miserably. The year is 1979. The disco craze that swept the U.S. is suffering from a major cultural backlash and will soon be replaced by a new wave of music. The entire world is watching as a nuclear power plant in rural Pennsylvania comes dangerously close to a full meltdown. And one of the most popular board games of all time, Trivial Pursuit, is released to the public. In the world of television, the USA Network, Sports Network ESPN, and Kids Channel Nickelodeon make their debut on basic cable. It was also the year our first failed horror pilot made its debut. This was one of the many TV pilots of that era that began as a TV movie in order to gauge audience interest and see if there might be enough there to warrant an order to go to a full series. In this case, of course, it did not. The TV movie in question is the rather unimaginatively named vampire film Vampire. Yeah, it's just called Vampire.
You up to talking? I've been watching you since it happened.
Watching.
None of this is easy to accept. By nature, I suppose I'm a skeptic. It took me a long time to realize that if you truly accept the existence of God, then you also have to accept the reality of evil. I had a good friend once. Back in 1939, we were assigned to a series of homicides in the Bryant Park area. The victims' throats were torn out. But there was never found a trace of blood at the crime scenes. That's right. Like the recent ones. Like your wife. Officially, we were looking for a homicidal maniac, but Bernier didn't see it that way. He'd always been religious. In time, he came to believe that what we were looking for was a vampire. Yes.
He leaned over me and made me look into his eyes. I saw what my wife must have seen. And I tried to fight it with everything in me, just as I know she tried, but it was impossible. I'm going to kill him or die trying. It's that simple.
Then you'll have to kill the both of us.
No.
Alone, neither one of us stands a chance. But together, who knows? It's already begun, Ron. We've both had our minor victories. He's not going to let us get away with that. Think. Try to think like he thinks.
I'm going to destroy you.
It upsets you, I know. I underestimated you, too. You're the best of years. Centuries, in fact. Excellence deserves reward. Leave now. I promise you'll be rid of me forever. Let her go. She's really...
Anton, no.
Enough. Get out. Our little game was amusing for a while. No more. It ends. Here. Now. One way or the other. Speak to this old fool, John Love. Tell him what's at stake if he persists. Only the life of an old man. No loved ones, Harry? Andrea here? The little boy in Arizona? Think. I'm giving you an opportunity to leave. You've earned it. But pursue this madness further, and I warn you. Divest yourself of everyone dear, or I'll drain drop by drop.
Vampire was directed by E.W. Swackhammer. Yes, I'm serious. Mr. Swackhammer, you gotta forgive me, I just love saying that name, had been directing TV since the early 1960s with around 100 credits to his name before he passed in 1994. Swackhammer. The film centers on an ancient vampire named Anton Wojtek, who was accidentally unearthed by construction workers while building a new church in San Francisco. Wojtek had been entombed centuries earlier and, once released, begins to resume his reign of terror by seducing women and preying on unsuspecting necks in order to sustain himself, like you do. A pair of architects responsible for the construction soon find themselves entangled in the dark mystery surrounding the strange deaths and Wojtek's predatory nature. As they piece together the horrifying truth, they are thrust into a battle of survival, using both modern science and ancient methods to defeat the vampire. Now, the movie plays with traditional vampire lore while giving it a bit of a modern twist, exploring the tension between science and superstition as the characters try to stop a timeless evil that is unleashed upon the world. Now, what Vampire lacks in the title department, it actually more than makes up for when it comes to the people in front of and behind the screen. Apart for the aforementioned Swackhammer, Vampire was written by TV legend Stephen Bochco. Now, if you're not familiar with the name, you will certainly know some of the projects he's been associated with. Here's the short list: Columbo, Macmillan and Wife, The White Shadow, Hill Street Blues, L.A. Law, Doogie Howser, M.D., NYPD Blue, and Murder One. So, this was no amateur hour production. As for the cast, well, it had a pretty amazing lineup. Playing the church architect, you had Jason Miller, who, without a doubt, is best known for playing the doubting young priest Father Karras in the classic horror film The Exorcist. And his partner in crime here is veteran actor E.G. Marshall. Great name. Now, where would you have seen him? Well, I don't know, in movies like 12 Angry Men, Superman 2, Creepshow, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. The list goes on like 150 more times. And last, but certainly not least, our vampire himself. He was played by a truly fascinating actor, one whose life story could be a movie in itself. His name is Richard Lynch. If you don't know anything about him, well, strap yourselves in. This is going to be crazy. Born in Brooklyn, New York, Richard Lynch developed a passion for acting after serving in the United States Marine Corps. His rugged good looks could have made him a star and a leading man in Hollywood. However, in 1967, just as his career was beginning, a terrible drug-related incident altered Lynch's life and his appearance forever. Lynch himself recounted the tragic events in a 1968 interview.
Richard Lynch is an actor. Until June this year, he was also an LSD user.
On June the 28th, 1967, I had strolled into the park of Central Park, and with a half a gallon of gasoline, I set myself on fire under the influence of LSD. I have had quite a few LSD experiences. When I attempted my last trip, I had just finished a screen test with Columbia Motion Pictures, and my career was flowering. I was a prosperous, promising young actor. If you would ever tell me that I would go into Central Park and try to burn myself to death, I would say that you were out of your mind. If you've taken your last, what you call your last LSD trip, and you really want to be hip, well, dig it, man. Be hip. Lay off it, because it does affect the mind. I'm a perfect example of what LSD can do to the human mind.
Lynch suffered burns on over 70% of his body, including his face. He persevered, however, and made his film debut in the 1973 film Scarecrow alongside Gene Hackman and Al Pacino. Lynch successfully pivoted from being a leading man to playing villains for most of his career, including many roles in genre films, particularly horror and science fiction. He amassed an impressive list of acting credits, appearing in nearly 200 films and television shows, until his death from a heart attack in 2012. Lynch's considerable skills as an actor were on full display in Vampire. His Anton Wojtek is a wealthy, seductive bloodsucker, and Lynch does a fantastic job in the role. Now, of course, the whole point of a TV pilot is to hopefully have it become a series. Now, despite the pilot's relative success, or is it success? It wasn't enough to become a series. Had that happened, you'd see our fang-faced friend on the run from vampire hunters episode after episode. So basically The Fugitive with just slightly more neck-biting. Now, if you would care to add Vampire to your Halloween viewing list, the full TV movie is available to watch for free on YouTube. And we'll be right back after these messages.
Hey, I'm no numbskull, so call me at 1-900-909-2233, and you'll hear the funniest monster jokes like, what's a vampire's favorite sport? Basketball. Or the one about the ghoul who missed her mummy. You'll also find out how to get these scary street signs featuring my friends Dracula, Wolfman, and Frankenstein. It costs $2.45 for a 2-minute message, so ask your mom or dad if it's okay before you call 1-900-909. I'm dying to make you laugh.
For Halloween, Toys R Us doesn't miss a trick, and the prices are a treat. We've got costumes for all Toys R Us kids, even grown-ups, and loads of candy, makeup, masks, and more. Toys R Us will make your Halloween supernatural.
The Halloween experts at Magic Manor have everything you'll need this year, including actual character masks from famous motion pictures. And they can show you the proper application of makeup to impress that special someone. Magic Manor's professional hand-painted custom masks start as low as $250. This Halloween, remember Magic Manor. Wigs, masks, makeup, costumes, shockingly authentic. Magic Manor, East Wind Mall.
And we're back. Continuing with our theme of 1970s horror TV pilots, we go to the year 1977. It was the year that Star Wars changed modern cinema. The year rock and roll's first icon, Elvis Presley, passed away. And the year Fonzie literally jumped the shark on the 5th season of sitcom Happy Days. It was also the zenith of America's obsession with all things occult. Much of this fascination with the supernatural was born from the cultural upheaval of the previous decade. In the 1960s, experimentation with psychedelic drugs, the influence of Eastern cultures, and the rejection of traditional structures of authority all played a role. As the Vietnam War dragged on, disillusionment with the government grew, and people began to question established institutions. In this environment of skepticism and unrest, many Americans started looking for alternative spiritual paths, which often led them towards mysticism, astrology, and other occult practices. This fostered the so-called New Age movement. The blending of these spiritual systems with occult beliefs created a perfect storm for America's growing interest in the paranormal. The 1970s saw an explosion of media content related to the occult. Hollywood, recognizing the public's growing fascination with the supernatural, produced a string of films that played on themes of demonic possession, witchcraft, and the paranormal. Astrology columns became a staple in newspapers and magazines, and people from all walks of life began consulting their horoscopes to gain insight into their lives. The zodiac signs and planetary movements were believed to influence not only individual behavior, but also broader world events. And the rise of Wiccan practices gave new life to ancient pagan rituals and beliefs. Witchcraft was no longer seen solely as a sinister or evil practice, but was reframed as a spiritual path grounded in nature, personal empowerment, and community. So why did all this come to fruition during the 70s? Well, the decade was a time of deep cultural anxieties, which contributed to the nation's fascination with the occult. Economic stagnation, rising crime rates, and fears of nuclear annihilation created a pervasive sense of dread. Now, as traditional sources of security and stability seemed to falter, many Americans turned to the supernatural as a way to cope with their fears. The occult could offer a means of understanding and perhaps even controlling the unknown forces at work in their lives. So it was no surprise that mass media was all over the supernatural. One particularly fertile ground was the TV movie, like our first entry, Vampire. Dozens of spooky fright flicks dominated the airwaves in the 70s, with titles like Summer of Fear, directed by Nightmare on Elm Street's Wes Craven. There was The House That Would Not Die, The Devil's Daughter, the 1979 adaptation of Stephen King's Salem Lot, Satan's School for Girls, and our second entry, Good Against Evil.
Jessica and Andrew Stewart are in love. And as long as that love endures, Jessica's union with Astaroth cannot be consummated.
Your Jessica has been chosen to bear the child of Astaroth.
Oh, Father, come on. You don't expect me to believe that?
You saw that poor child upstairs. You saw Father Wheatley dead. You've met the presence of evil. Is it so difficult to believe?
Because there's got to be a rational explanation for everything. I know that.
You know nothing.
I know that I'll never stop loving her.
And I know they'll do anything they can to stop you.
Do you have a better suggestion?
An exorcism.
Father, we're not living in the Dark Ages.
You can prove that.
I don't want to hear philosophy. My child is desperately ill.
Unless we get her out of here and perform a rite of exorcism, your child will die.
Good Against Evil has a few things in common with our first entry, Vampire. They both feature a wicked, supernaturally powered character, and that character is played by Richard Lynch. He does get around. Now, the TV movie is the story of a writer, Paul Varney, played by Dak Rambo, whose first name is actually Norman, but Norman Rambo doesn't sound as tough. And he falls in love with a young woman named Julie, only to discover that she is the target of an evil satanic sect. Now we begin the festivities with the mysterious circumstances surrounding Julie's birth, as she was raised by a devil-worshipping cult, like you do, to serve as the bride for a powerful demon, played with satanic glee by our friend, Mr. Richard Lynch. Unaware of her dark destiny, Julie and Paul begin a romance, but strange occurrences begin to disrupt their lives. Paul's attempts to understand what's happening lead him to Father Kemsler, a priest well-versed in the occult. As Paul learns the truth, he becomes determined to save Julie from the cult's evil clutches. However, the evil forces surrounding her, led by the sinister demon, have long been preparing for this moment, and they are not easily defeated. Father Klemscher joins Paul in a desperate fight to free Julie from her frightful fate. Now, Good Against Evil blends elements of romantic drama and occult horror, focusing on the battle between, you guessed it, the forces of good and evil. Now, because it was originally intended as a pilot for a TV series, the film leaves several plot threads unresolved, with the central battle against the demon left open-ended. Now, all things considered, it's not a terrible movie. It's not particularly good either, despite Richard Lynch's delightful scene chewing as the demon. It's a tad on the dull side, and the fact that because it was meant to be a pilot for a series, the unresolved ending really hurts the film. But if you really want to see a battle between the forces of light against the demons of darkness, and who doesn't, and, on a 1970s TV budget, you can also find Good Against Evil for free on YouTube. Now, there are worse ways to spend your time than watching a Richard Lynch double feature. You're welcome. And that, my friends, does it for week 2 of Halloween Horror Month 2024. Thank you for listening. Next week, a horrific Hollywood hype looks at the bloody good marketing machine behind the new Gorefest, Terrifier 3, and the films that inspired it. If you like, please subscribe to this program through your preferred podcast purveyor and write a review if you are so inclined. And if you have any suggestions or comments, please send them to thedeepdivepodcast@gmail.com. All clips used in this podcast are meant for educational purposes only and not to infringe on existing copyrights. The Deep Dive Podcast family of programs are a production of Automaton Studios.
In this all-new movie on DVD, can Scooby-Doo conquer the Outback? And catch the vampires?
Zoinks! It's the vampire!
Scooby-Doo and the Legend of the Vampire. You can own it only on DVD and video.
Scooby-Dooby-Doo!